In this video, we'll be doing a deep dive into the history of sentencing in the district, as well as why the DC Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines was created. My name is Brittany Bunch, the Outreach Specialist with the DC Sentencing Commission. We're the agency that implements, monitors, as well as supports the district's voluntary sentencing guidelines. We also provide sentencing policy recommendation to the council. If you're interested in learning more about the history of the DC Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines, then you'll enjoy this video. Keep watching. Many people believe that the district's interest in creating a sentencing guidelines started in the late 90s following Congress's passage of the National Capital Revitalization and Self-Government Improvement Act of 1997. However, the district's interest in creating a structured sentencing system for felony sentencing recommendations started in the early 80s. During this time, there was a consensus among Superior Court judges that sentencing was often arbitrary, uncertain, and potentially unfair. DC Superior Court Chief Judge Carl Moultrie assembled an 18-member Sentencing Guideline Commission. Under the Chief Judge, the Sentencing Guideline Commission consisted of representatives from the Council of the District of Columbia, DC Superior Courts, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Public Defender Service, and other members of the criminal justice community in the district. The commission was tasked with determining the most effective guideline system. It was also important to the commission that they propose a sentencing system that would be appropriate for both common and unusual factual situations. After reviewing other states' guidelines and sentencing systems, the Commission found that a sentencing grid format would allow for a straightforward sentencing recommendation system for judges to utilize. Essentially, the system would have focused on two factors: the severity of the offense and the criminal history of the individual being sentenced. The system would have also featured alternatives for unusual situations that required a more or less severe sentence outside of the proposed sentencing ranges. The guideline system that the Superior Court's Sentencing Guideline Commission proposed was never adopted. However, the Commission circulated its proposal to judges, many of whom informally adhered to its sentencing ranges when imposing felony sentences. This initial proposal also had a major impact on the creation of the DC Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines that are used today. In fact, the Sentencing Guideline Commission's work was used as a starting point for our current guidelines. In the late 90s, there was a major focus on how those who were convicted of violent offenses should be sentenced. Legislators at the time were pushing for more concrete sentences. The 1990s saw Congress pass several key statutes that greatly affected how district defendants were sentenced. It started with the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which led to the National Capital Revitalization and Self-Government Improvement Act of 1997. Both statutes made way for major changes in sentencing in the district. As a result of the National Capital Revitalization and Self-Government Improvement Act of 1997, in 2000, the district moved from an indeterminate sentencing system to a determinate sentencing system. Under the district's indeterminate sentencing system, at initial sentencing, the sentencing judge would sentence each defendant to a sentencing range. For example, 5 to 15 years incarceration. The DC Parole Commission would then determine when the defendant was released within that range. Following the transition to a determinate sentencing system, judges sentenced defendants to a specific amount of time, not a range. The defendant would expect to serve at least 85% of the sentence imposed. The Bureau of Prison could reduce a defendant's sentence up to 15% for good behavior. Upon release from incarceration, the defendant would then be placed on a set period of supervised release. The change was made to foster more transparent and consistent violent crime sentencing. At the same time, DC Department of Corrections' only prison, the Lorton Reformatory, was closed and all sentenced DC inmates was transferred to the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. The last prisoner was transferred out of Lorton in the fall of 2001. The DC Parole Commission was also shuttered, and DC defendants on parole or supervised release were transferred to the jurisdiction of the U.S. Parole Commission. To this day, all sentenced DC inmates are still held by the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. While the federal statute only mandated determinate sentences for violent felony offenses, the Council of the District of Columbia was concerned about having two separate sentencing systems for different types of felony offenses. In early 2000, the Council created the Advisory Commission on Sentencing to make recommendations about implementing the requirements of the National Capital Revitalization and Self-Government Improvement Act of 1997 and to other possible changes to DC's sentencing system. The Advisory Commission issued recommendations to the Council, which determined that the district should not move forward with two separate sentencing systems. Rather, DC should use a determinate sentencing system for all offenses. The Advisory Commission also recommended the creation of the Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines for both violent and nonviolent felony offenses. Between 2000 and 2004, the Advisory Commission drafted the DC Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines. After thorough research and debate, the Council of the District of Columbia enacted the Advisory Commission on Sentencing Structured Sentencing System Pilot Program Amendment of 2004. On June 14, 2004, the District of Columbia Superior Courts began imposing sentences under the DC Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines for all felony offenses. The guidelines recommended the following: the type of sentence to impose, and the length of sentence to impose. During this time, the Council also made the Advisory Commission on Sentencing a permanent agency and renamed it the District of Columbia Sentencing Commission. In 2006, the sentencing guidelines became permanent, and the Council expanded the role of the Sentencing Commission to include proposing holistic revisions of the DC Criminal Code. In 2011, the DC Sentencing Commission submitted its first piece of recommended legislation concerning the revision to the Criminal Code. The Commission noticed the inconsistency in fines based on offenses and decided to create a policy to address this issue. The Fine Proportionality Act of 2011 created a proportionality structure for the maximum fine that can be imposed for each offense. The size of the fine was tied to the maximum term of imprisonment that may be imposed. As the scope of the Commission's code reform work increased, the Council created a separate agency solely focused on proposing possible revisions to DC's criminal code. On October 1st, 2016, the DC Criminal Code Reform Commission was born, and the DC Sentencing Commission resumed focusing solely on sentencing in the district. Currently, the DC Sentencing Commission monitors the application of the DC Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines. As necessary, changes are made to reflect revisions to the guidelines and accommodate new or modified offenses enacted by the Council. The Commission is also one of the district's premier criminal justice research agencies. Through a partnership with the Superior Court and Court Services and Offender Supervision Agency, the agency that calculates every felony defendant's criminal history score. The Commission collects and analyzes sentencing data to determine if sentences imposed in DC Superior Courts are compliant with the DC Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines, to identify potential problem areas and to monitor sentencing trends. In 2020, the Commission partnered with the Metropolitan Police Department to expand its data system to track felony cases starting from arrest through final disposition and sentencing. The Commission also provides information to practitioners and the public on the application of the guidelines in the form of regular trainings for criminal justice agencies, as well as having staff available on a day-to-day basis to assist judges, attorneys, court staff, pre-sentence report writers, and the public in the application of the guidelines in actual cases. SCDC pursues activities that further its mission to implement, monitor, and support the district's voluntary sentencing guidelines and promote fair and consistent sentencing policies. We strive to increase the public's understanding of sentencing policies and practices, as well as evaluate the effectiveness of the guidelines to recommend changes based on actual sentencing and corrections practices and research. The public is encouraged to contact the Commission with any inquiries about the guidelines or questions concerning training opportunities. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel right now. Just click on the subscribe button below this video. Also, be sure to check out our website at www.scdc.dc.gov and follow us on our social media accounts. Links are in the description box below. Stay tuned for our next video. In our next video, we'll be exploring how the DC Voluntary Sentencing Guidelines function in regards to sentencing in the district. Now, I want to turn it over to you. What questions do you have regarding DC sentencing? Let us know by leaving a comment below.